Wonderful. It's lovely to see you here. If I have not met you before, my name's Tim, and we're getting back into the swing after all the wonderful Christmas events that we had, all the carols by laser-light, carol-light, folkiness, and we're starting a new year wearing Christmas jumpers that were given by my dear wife. So things are looking kind of good. And we're going to think a little bit about our new series looking at spiritual disciplines this evening. The day's been quite busy already. This afternoon we commissioned Matt Smith. Some of you know Matt and Mim, who are part of the congregation here. Matt's kind of Mim moved up to the branch community church there to lead that. So we had a great commissioning service as Matt starts his role leading that congregation up there. So I preached at that service already. So it's my second preach in about 4 hours. So I hope you kind of bear with me, and I hope I don't fall asleep in my own sermon. But hopefully kind of it'll be encouraging enough to keep myself awake. Christmas time and all the indulgences. How many of you really enjoyed Christmas? I love Christmas time. I love all the kind of stuff that we get. But probably when you start the new year, you start thinking, okay, all the kind of the fun, all the food, all the kind of leisure, we're back to the seriousness of life now. And for some people, kind of making a resolution to try and kind of get life into some kind of order is something you may try and may indeed fail to do. But we've got a new series this month of January, looking at what we call spiritual disciplines. And tonight we're looking at the spiritual discipline of fasting and feasting. And I'm not quite sure what you think when you hear about spiritual disciplines. It sounds slightly kind of hardcore, doesn't it? Spiritual disciplines. It's like the new regime. Here's a regime, and kind of we kind of know that life ought to be we ought to lose a little bit of weight. We ought to be slightly fitter. We ought to use our leisure time a bit more, and we've got this kind of slightly guilt complex that we ought to kind of discipline ourselves to live life and just through willpower and determination. And I think sometimes when we say things like spiritual disciplines, things like kind of prayer and Bible reading that Nigel's mentioned, but solitude and worship and giving and fasting, we think, a little bit hardcore. Maybe it's not for me. I love coming to church. I love the worship. I love kind of receiving all that God has for me. And kind of, I'll live the rest of my life just on kind of having Christianity as a little kind of add-on. And spiritual discipline sounds a little bit too kind of too spiritual for you. Or maybe even too hard work, or too much like kind of trying that bit harder. And I think if you regard spiritual disciplines like that, you miss out on the most phenomenal way to live your life. Someone called John Wesley, who lived a long time ago, when he talked about these disciplines or these routines or these things that you put into your Christian life, he had this great phrase which I love, and I think in some ways sums up to me a better description of spiritual disciplines. And he calls them this. He calls them the means of grace. The means of grace. Here's some things that in life are means by which we can receive God's grace. I'm not sure if any of you have ever kind of been walking in the mountains and come across a reservoir. Any of you kind of come across a reservoir? I've got a picture here of a reservoir that, because there's something about a reservoir that is hidden. There's something about a reservoir that is a resource that's up in the mountains, far, far away from a city or a town that might use the water. Have we got that photo of the reservoir, the dam reservoir? Here it is. You come across this great reserve, this great resource, water that is essential for life. And someone at some point has built a dam, and they've stored up this immense, vast reserve of H2O, of liquid life. And it could be that dam just stops the water and just builds up the reservoir. But there's pipes. I don't know if you can see, you can see at the bottom of the reservoir there. There's a huge kind of pipe that comes out at the bottom of the reservoir. And that pipe goes for kind of hundreds of miles and takes that water, delivers that water to the place where it's needed. And in some ways, I think at the start of this new year, when I think about God, with God, there's a reservoir of His grace. The good news is, as we start 2018, that God has got so much love, so much hope, so much peace, so much forgiveness, so much light, so much victory, that it's like this kind of unseen, hidden reservoir, that God's grace is there. His heart is full for you. His heart longs to do you good, to bless you, to be with you, to take you through the highs and lows of the year ahead. And in some ways, in the heavenly realms, in the unseen world, there's like this reservoir of God's grace, God's hope, His forgiveness, His truth. And spiritual disciplines, the things that we're going to be looking at this month, they're like the pipework. It's like the pipework that takes the goodness of God, that takes the mercy of God, that takes the grace of God, and somehow all that God longs for, all that God dreams of, all that God hopes for us, it's the means by which we access those into our lives. And so spiritual disciplines aren't just trying a little bit harder, trying to be a bit nicer, trying to kind of like trying to lose weight or trying to be that bit fitter. Somehow I ought to try these things just to be a better Christian. Actually, they are means by which this year you can encounter the grace of God, the love of God, the forgiveness of God. Because what happens is life can be so busy, life can be so pressurized, life can have all its demands. The things that we see physically with our eyes, they dominate our choices. And what happens is there's the business of life can carry on, that although God has this reservoir of love and hope and truth and forgiveness that He would love to pour in your life, you're too busy, you're too preoccupied to receive those. Things of life and the business and the call out of social media on your time and the demands and the deadlines at work and the pressures within family life, all those things shout very loudly, and life can just carry on from day to day, week to week, month to month, and you may not encounter the love and truth and forgiveness and hope and peace of Jesus. Why? Because those things predominate. And so what spiritual disciplines are, they're God's gift to us. They're like, here's some means by which you can receive God's full grace, His generous, outrageous love, His hope and His forgiveness, His clarity, His destiny, His truth, all these things God longs to pour into our life, but so frequently we're so kind of busy with other kind of stuff, we don't get a chance to access, we don't get a chance to receive. It's like there's a big dam that's got this reservoir, but there's no pipework that's delivering that water to the point of need. And so over these next 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to look and say, what are some of these means? What are some of the things that God's given to us? It means not to earn God's blessing, not to earn God's grace, because we can't earn those things. But how can we best receive what God wants to give to us this year? How can we best live our life under the generosity, the compassion, the kindness, the forgiveness of God? And in some ways, these spiritual disciplines, the things that we choose to do to put aside some of the physical kind of things and the demands in our life, we put those to one side. For spiritual ends, to encounter God's grace, we're going to make these choices. And tonight, as we start this series, we're going to think about something that for many, maybe it's slightly a strange thing. We're going to look at fasting. And how is fasting not a means of making your life miserable, making you hungry, kind of making you grumpy, your low blood sugar level, all that kind of stuff, but how is fasting a spiritual gift from God that He gives to us that's a means for us this year to encounter God's grace, a means to encounter His presence? It's something that we can choose to do to make space in our routine that God can break in with His love and hope. So Jesus says this about fasting. This is from Matthew's Gospel. He says, when you fast, don't look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you're fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen. And your Father who's seen what's done in secret will reward you. Here's Jesus, and He says that there's something about fasting. There's something about fasting that we should, if we're following Jesus, we should do. Now, I'm not sure, how many of you have ever tried fasting? Okay. How many of you found it a very enjoyable experience? Okay. Actually, because it is slightly weird, isn't it? It's slightly weird to think that I'm going to give up eating food, maybe for one meal, maybe for one day, actually maybe for 1 week. And kind of what's going on there? When kind of is it just some kind of Eastern mystic kind of thing. Is that what fasting is? Should we, as 21st century people who want to follow Jesus, should we be involved with fasting? And I think the answer is yes, but I think we need to understand what fasting is and what fasting isn't. Fasting is abstaining from physical food. I think predominantly, you may want to look at other kinds of fasting, but predominantly when we talk about fasting, it is about abstaining from food for spiritual purposes. But I think some people maybe think that fasting is a bit like, there's a certain kind of stream that would think that fasting is aestheticism. Aestheticism, that's looking at. Do you know what that is? Aestheticism is this kind of Greekish kind of idea that the spiritual life is good, the physical life is bad. And actually, this physical body is bad and evil. Therefore, I need to kind of beat it up. I need to submit this body. And so kind of self-flagellation, wearing sackcloth, kind of crawling over glass, or fasting, kind of, because I've got to mistreat this body because my physical flesh is evil and spiritual things are good. And fasting isn't that. Fasting isn't about kind of teaching your body a jolly good lesson because it's evil. I don't think fasting, it's not asceticism. I don't think it's a hunger strike either. Do you know what a hunger strike is? A hunger strike is where people, maybe they're in prison and they feel they've got no other way to get a decision, to make someone change their mind. So maybe they have some arguments first of all. When they're getting nowhere, they go on hunger strike. I'm not going to eat until you do what I ask. And some people maybe feel that fasting is a bit like that. God, I want you to answer my prayer. Answer my prayer. Answer my prayer. I'm gonna not eat any food until you answer my prayer. And it's kind of as if you're kind of trying to twist God's arm up behind his back. And I don't think fasting is a hunger strike. Actually, I don't think fasting is magical. As if somehow, if we fast, there's kind of something magical is going to happen. And I think it's supernatural, but I don't think it's magical that somehow if we kind of and sometimes people kind of treat it a bit like that. I'm not sure if you do, but treat it as this thing that if kind of I mustn't. If I'm going to decide to fast, I've got to not fast and stay right to the end, and otherwise it's not going to. Or if I tell somebody by mistake that I'm fasting, broken the magic. I can remember one time when we had a week of prayer and fasting, and Rob, who Nigel mentioned, myself and my wife Bev were in a meeting, and it was for the week of prayer and fasting, and we knew kind of Rob was fasting, and my wife doesn't really like fasting at all. So the biscuits came round, kind of, and Rob helped himself to a biscuit and put it kind of by the side of his chair, and Bev thinking that obviously he's fasting, he's kind of trying to be polite. What I'll do is I'll kind of sneak the biscuit so that it doesn't embarrass the host. I'll sneak the biscuit and kind of I'll eat it for him, and kind of he can carry on fasting. Anyway, Rob saw Bev's hand kind of heading towards the biscuit. He snatched it up, took a great big bite out of it, and Bev said, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I thought you were fasting." And it's like Rob almost choked trying to spit this biscuit out, thinking, "Oh no, I'm fasting," as if somehow the magic, the mystery of fasting was somehow at that point was, drat it was broken. But fasting isn't like that. Fasting is not some kind of thing that I've got to somehow, if I tell somebody, it's lost the power. So what is fasting? I think it's not a hunger strike. It's not. I was in a very strange meeting with Rachel and a few other leaders, and there was two men who'd been losing weight, two male leaders, and they were talking about the diets. That were a very strange meeting, wasn't it? Talk about the diets they've been involved with, and there is kind of this eat 5, fast 2 kind of diet plan. Actually, fasting isn't about dieting as well. Fasting is about abstaining from physical food for spiritual purposes. And it's something that I believe is biblical. It's there in the Bible, and in the Old Testament, it's kind of people would fast, particularly where they felt that they'd lost the presence of God, if they needed to confess, they'd lived their lives the wrong way. Quite frequently, there would be confession and fasting. When you come to the New Testament, Jesus mentions fasting a couple of times, and in Acts of the Apostles, they would worship and fast. And as they're worshiping and fasting, God speaks to the people there. Bible characters like Moses and David, Elijah, Esther, Daniel, Anna, Paul, and Jesus himself, they all fasted. And if we're going to follow Jesus, I think just choosing at some point, now you may never have fasted before, But if it's a means by which you can receive God's grace, what you need for this year, his peace, his hope, his forgiveness, his healing, if it's a means to receive God's grace, why not give it a go? In the Bible, there's different kinds of fasting. There's kind of like a normal fast. A normal fast is just not eating food. Then there's an absolute fast like in Esther or in Acts chapter 9, verse 9. An absolute fast is no food and no drink. So fasting, you just have no solid food and you can drink water or juice, fruit smoothies, maybe slightly cheating, I don't know. Again, there's no rules to fasting. But a normal fast, no food, absolute fast, no food or drink. There are a few fasts in the Bible that are kind of super fasts. Super fasts are kind of fasts that are supernatural. You can probably last for 3 days without water. You can probably last over 40 days without food. But you can't last 40 days without food and water. But there seems to be with Elijah in 1 Kings, maybe with Jesus in the desert as well, that they go for these fasts that seem to be super prolonged fasts. Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 9 as well. And I wouldn't encourage anybody to go on a super fast. I think those are very unusual. But there are fasts in the Bible as well that are partial fasts. And I know for some people when we talk about fasting, either because of a medical condition you've got, you might be pregnant, it may be that you've had issues with eating disorders in the past and you know that kind of food and control just is a kind of really kind of tricky issue for you. But the Bible does mention about partial fasts, and it's not about giving up food totally, but how you restrict your diet. In Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 10, Daniel goes on a restricted diet. He goes on a vegetarian diet for a bit of time. And it may be that in fasting you choose to just restrict what you do. I know for myself there's times where I fasted having sugar in my tea. I mean, for some people that doesn't mean anything. But for me, every time I drink a cup of tea or coffee without sugar in, I just think, that tastes horrible. Oh, I know why. I'm fasting. God, I want you to break in. God, I want you to bring life to the situation. And sometimes a partial fast around things that you can eat or drink. There's special fasts. So in 1 Corinthians 7, it talks about abstaining in a marriage relationship, abstaining from sexual relations for the sake of prayer. And again, some people today think, well, maybe I won't fast food, but maybe I can fast social media or the use of my phone or fast watching the television. And again, those kind of things are good for self-discipline. I'm not quite sure if they have the same dramatic impact as fasting food, because you can't live without food. I mean, humanly speaking, you can't live without food. Believe it or not, you can live without social media. I know it's true. Believe it or not, actually, you can live without the television. You can live without watching EastEnders or Hollyoaks. Or you can live without those things. Actually, you can't live without food. And there's something about fasting food, fasting this very thing that's the essence of what sustains us. Fasting the physical food because you know there's spiritual food. Because you know there's spiritual life, because you know there's more to this world than we can just kind of satisfy with filling our stomachs. And in some ways, fasting food for spiritual purposes, it's saying I'm going to abstain from the thing that holds this life together, because I know there's an eternal life. There's a spiritual life that needs feeding, that needs nurturing, that needs care. And in some ways, the abstaining from physical food means that we can encounter the spiritual life. Jesus, he does talk about feasting and fasting. Dave Mitchell, when he puts the series together, said, I want you to do about feasting and fasting. And it's linked in the Mark passage where John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And some people came to Jesus and they said, how is it that John's disciples, they're very spiritual, they fast, and the disciples of the Pharisees, actually they're quite spiritual too, and they fast, but why don't your disciples fast? And Jesus says this to them. Jesus answered them, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and and on that day they will fast. And Jesus is saying this, and I think this is a fascinating thing about why is fasting a means of grace? Why is fasting something that we can choose to do? And maybe, like Nigel said, the week of prayer and fasting, maybe even next week, you take the chance to pray and choose to fast. Why is it that fasting and feasting are linked together? And I think it's when Jesus is with his disciples, when Jesus' presence is there, it's a time of feasting. When Jesus' presence isn't there, it's a time for fasting. So what turns fasting into feasting? E does. My northern roots coming through. What turns fasting into eating? E does. And there's something about Jesus. When Jesus is present, it's feasting. When he's there, it's feasting. When he's not there, it's fasting. And you know, that's probably, there's times in my life where I experience the presence of Jesus. And when I experience the presence and the love and the forgiveness and the hope and the joy of Jesus, actually it's a time to celebrate. It's a time to say thank you, God. It's a time to enjoy that season of my life. But I know there's times, maybe for you, there's times where somehow it's not that God doesn't still love you, but just somehow his presence seems to be a bit absent. That your own relationship with him seems to be a bit dry. That his presence isn't there. And Jesus is saying when the bridegroom's around, it's feasting time. But when the bridegroom's not around, it's fasting time. And I wonder, as we go into 2018, do you know the presence of God with you? Do you know the grace of God that's generously being lavished on your life? Do you know what it is to find his healing, to find his hope, to find his generosity? And if you do, feast, enjoy, celebrate. But if for some reason those things don't mark your life at the moment, maybe the means to experience God's grace is fasting. Maybe that's one of the things to say, God, I so realize that I need you, and I'm caught up in the regular stuff of life that I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop eating this meal, these 2 meals for this day. Why? Because I realize there's a hunger inside. It's a hunger once again for your presence. It's hunger for your forgiveness, for your hope, for your love to be filling me. And I'm not experiencing that at the moment. And so fasting and feasting go together. Jesus says that when I'm with you, you feast. When I'm without you, you fast. So have you got a hunger for God? In some ways, where you stop eating food, something happens to you. I'm not sure what happens to you when I stop eating food. My stomach starts to rumble. I start to have slight kind of pain. I start to have these cravings, kind of bacon sandwich, kind of. Actually, do you know what? My blood sugar level goes down. I get slightly grumpy. Actually, I'm not sure about you, but if I try praying when I'm fasting, actually, I fall asleep. I mean, somehow, if I try and fast and pray instead, somehow my concentration is a bit shot at. But I know that when I'm fasting, those kind of messages that my physical body tries to send me to say, feed me, feed me, feed me, it just reminds me, it's like a physical prayer. It's saying, but man cannot live by bread alone. I've got to live by things that proceed, that come from the mouth of God. Things, that great reservoir in heaven, all the riches that are with Jesus in heavenly places. I need to access those. And the means of grace, fasting is one of those ways. And it is slightly strange and it is slightly mysterious, but maybe why don't you give it a go? There's 3 spiritual disciplines that Jesus puts together in Matthew chapter 6. And the first one is about giving. There's something about how do we, as someone who's got capacity to receive from God, while generosity of giving increases our capacity to receive. So Jesus says, when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogue. And he goes on and says, but your Father who sees what's done in secret will reward you. The second spiritual discipline, the second means of grace is prayer. We're going to look at this next week. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues or on the street corner to be seen by everybody. but go away secretly. When your Father who sees what's done in secret, he will reward you. And the third thing is when you fast, don't look somber as the hypocrites do, and it goes like I read earlier on, and your Father who sees what's done in secret will reward you. And there's these three disciplines that Jesus says: give, pray, fast. Now, I think for many of you, if you say that I'm a Jesus-following person and you've been a Christian for a while, you probably realize that actually giving is one of the spiritual disciplines, is one of the things that God asks us to do. We freely receive, therefore we freely give. And maybe for some of you, you regularly choose to give, maybe by a standing order, or maybe when we have an offering here on a second Sunday. Maybe you think, once a month, I'm going to make sure that I regularly give. For some of you, you maybe have routines of prayer. It may be routines of personal prayer in the morning, in the evening, at lunch break, at work. Maybe you have routines of at community church every Tuesday morning from 6:45 to 7:30, we have a prayer gathering. And I love being there. It's part of my routine. I know that I should be praying and meeting with other people in the morning to pray. It's a great routine. And maybe you've got routines of prayer. But have you got routines of fasting? Or is it just kind of crisis? Here's somebody who needs some healing. We'll fast. Here's kind of I need God to provide something for me. I've tried praying, but I'm going to now pray and fast. And maybe we reserve fasting for crisis times or high days and holidays. Well, you don't just reserve giving for crisis times, although you may give in crisis. You don't reserve prayer just for crisis times, although you may pray in crisis times. You choose to do that regularly. And I wonder whether regular fasting should be something that's part of our life. I know for myself, my own routine is the first Monday of each month is a fast day for me, because, and not for anything in particular, I just think I regularly give, I regularly pray, therefore I should, if I'm following Jesus, following what he says here in Matthew 6, I should regularly fast. And so I choose to regularly fast. Now, what does it do for me? Well, it's not that I'm specifically praying for an issue and I can measure the success of my prayer life because I'm fasting, but do you know what? It's like fasting opens those great big pipes to the reservoir. There's something about fasting that means that I can access the grace and the hope and the peace and the love of God. I can't somehow describe exactly how it works, but I know that it does work. If you look at Isaiah 58, you see there in this great prophetic kind of chapter talking about fasting, and fasting is linked to breakthrough. It is linked to increased revelation. It is linked to God's presence being with us. It's linked to breakthrough through deliverance. It's interesting in Mark chapter 9 when Jesus' disciples try and cast out a demon and they can't. And Jesus comes and he gives a word and the boy's set free. And the disciples say, why couldn't we do that? And Jesus says, this sort only comes out through prayer and fasting. And Jesus didn't sort of look at this demon-possessed boy, go away and fast for a week and come back. He prayed and the boy was set free there. Why? Because I think Jesus had a regular life of prayer and fasting. And it brought that extra sense of power and life. And I think it could bring that extra sense of power and life to us as well. So as I finish, as we start a new year, God has a reservoir of grace hidden in the mountains of heaven, in the heavenly places, hidden for you. He wants this year for you to experience his forgiveness and his peace. He wants you to experience his hope. He wants you to experience his justice, his comfort. He wants you to experience kind of the healing that touches both your body and your soul. He wants they're hidden, but are we prepared to make space in the business of our life for these means of encountering God's grace? And I wonder if maybe the challenge, maybe this week, maybe next week, to say, God, I want to know that grace. I'm going to choose to give, to pray, to fast. I'm going to choose some of these other spiritual disciplines we'll look at over the next couple of weeks around solitude and around worship and around servanthood and these things that we can choose. We choose these pathways because, God, I want to experience your love. And I wonder, just as we finish, whether in your own mind, at the start of a new year, of whether you might choose some spiritual disciplines, Not as a harsh regime to throw yourself into, a bit like going down to the gym or kind of stop eating certain foods, but a means by which you can receive God's grace. Because that is a rewarding life. All those three passages, it talks about if you do these things, your Father who sees what you do in secret, he will reward you. There is a reward around doing these things. I've produced these little cards for you. They're little reward cards. And it's the Father's reward. And it's a great scheme. And there's three partners involved in this reward scheme. Those three partners are giving to the needy, prayer, and fasting. And maybe why don't you I've got some down at the front here as we come to worship now. Why don't you come and get one of these things to remind you? To remind you that there's some means of receiving God's grace. The things that we choose to do in secret, the Father will reward you. It's not that you're earning his forgiveness and hope and love and peace, but somehow as we choose these things, as we make space in our busy life, somehow those things break into, there's the reward of heaven, reward of the Father. And if at the start of this year you want to make space for God, make space for his hope, open up that pipeway to receive the mercy of God. As we come to worship in a moment, why don't you come forward and take one of these little cards, just a little sign. God, I want to make my choices for you, to receive the grace and the hope and the life you always intended. Let's pray together. And as we take a chance to pray, when we look about at the means of receiving grace, we look for fulfillment in life in all kinds of other places. And we can look for that in friendships. We can look for that in a career and education. We can look for that in the fridge. And food somehow just gives us the comfort that we need. And God is saying to us this evening, my grace is available for you. My forgiveness is available for you. My hope is available for you. So much more than you can dream or imagine is available tonight for you. And I just want to give a chance for us as we come to worship. Maybe I'll get the worship band to come and join me on the stage here. Just the chance for us to say to God, God, we want to, at the start of this new year, receive that grace to make space, whether it's through fasting, whether it's through praying, whether it's through reading the Bible, whether it's through serving, whether it's through giving. We want to make space to receive God's grace. And as we worship and as we say, God, I want to make those choices for you, it may be that you'd like to receive some prayer. Maybe actually this evening you'd like to kind of tap into that great reservoir of heaven and just receive some of God's grace. And maybe you're here this evening and you're troubled and you're fearful and you want to know some of his peace. It may be you've come here tonight with a physical ailment and you need some physical healing. Actually, I did wonder whether there's somebody who had a kind of a pain down just in the left-hand side of their groin here, and you've come and kind of it's just even now it's throbbing, it's really kind of sore, and God wants to pour out some healing for you. I had this impression in my mind as well that of somebody being winded, and it may be that you kind of today you've just physically been winded and kind of, but it was more like the sense of something happened last year, and you know what it is when kind of there's been a thump to the stomach and you just kind of, and you just on your inside, it's a bit like that. Something's happened. It's like you feel almost spiritual, like you're fighting for breath, and tonight God wants to give you your breath back again. He wants to give you that life back again. And if you feel that that's you, then there's going to be a prayer team down at the side here. And while we opening our hearts this year to receive the grace of God, to receive his mercy, to receive his hope, maybe you'd like to come to the prayer team and get one of the prayer team to pray for you. But let's stand together and let's take the chance to worship. And if you, while we're worshiping, you'd like to come to the front here, just a little mark saying, God, I need you. I want to make space for you. I want to know the grace that's available for me. Why don't you come and take one of these little kind of reward cards from the front here? It's just a little reminder of who God is and what he'll do for you. And if you'd like some prayer, do come and get some prayer from the prayer team.